Our borders are strong and secure, but there's always more we can do to further strengthen them.
That's Public Safety Minister Gary Anand-Desangri. Last week, he introduced the first piece of legislation from the new Mark Carney government.
This morning, I introduced Bill C-2, the Strong Borders Act.
The Strong Borders Act. It's a sweeping 139-page omnibus bill.
With this new legislation, we'll ensure Canada has the right tools to keep our borders secure, combat transnational organized crime and fentanyl, and disrupt illicit financing.
It would allow police to open and inspect mail from Canada Post. It would restrict cash transfers of over $10,000. It would give police access to subscription information. It would bolster surveillance of the border using helicopters, drones, and surveillance towers. It would expand what law enforcement can do without a warrant. It's deliberately timed and worded to send a message, not just to Canadians, but to one man in particular, Donald Trump.
There's elements that will strengthen the relationship with the United States. There are a number of elements in the bill that have been irritants for the U.S., so we are addressing some of those issues.
This is a huge bill. The proposed changes impact about a dozen federal departments. But there's one piece I want to focus in on.
Enhancing the integrity and fairness of our immigration system.
Bill C-2 will overhaul our asylum-seeking process. And it didn't take long for people to notice. Cue the public outrage.
It's an anti-immigration bill.
To my shock and surprise, the Liberals are actually taking a page out of Trump's book.
It's shockingly authoritarian and draconian in nature.
Oh, it's for border security, but we're going to bury all this crazy shit in it.
And on Sunday, Montrealers hit the street in protest. Our senior producer, Aviva Lessard, went to check it out.
If this bill passes, it will arbitrarily exclude entire categories of people from being able to access legal protection through Canada's refugee protection system.
I'm afraid that some people that are here might get deported.
We're just concerned as well about not just the actual measures that C-2 is bringing in, which are also horrifying, but the ideas and the principles behind it.
I think they're trying to send the message that they are serious about money and willing to make cuts, but that they are willing to threaten Canada's image as a humanitarian country.
This is Mark Carney's first real demonstration of how he intends to wield the powers of government in a moment when just south of the border, we're seeing ICE raids, mass deportations, and riots erupting in LA. This episode, I'm talking to Adam Sadinsky. He's an immigration and refugee lawyer and the co-chair of the advocacy committee for the Association of Refugee Lawyers. He's going to break down the government's asylum overhaul. What exactly is changing? Who's affected? And is Canada really heading towards American-style mass deportations? Or are the concerns overblown? Let's get into it. Adam, thank you so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me.
There's been a lot of changes to the immigration file over the past few years, from capping permanent resident targets.
We will reduce the number of immigrants we bring in over the next 3 years.
To cracking down on international student programs and temporary workers.
A temporary 2-year cap on new international student permits.
Reduce the number of low-wage temporary foreign workers in Canada.
Then came Bill C-2, which I think takes things a step further. Did you see the changes in the proposed bill coming?
I was shocked. This is giving the government the power to deport people to countries where they allege a risk of persecution without a hearing, without going before whoever's making the decision to explain why it would be dangerous for them to go home. That's what this is about.
Okay, let's get specific here. There's been a few changes. Let's focus on one of them. In broad strokes, the current asylum-seeking process right now is that you submit a claim, you gather your supporting evidence, you present it at a hearing at the IRB, which is the Immigration and Refugee Board. You have a back and forth with the board. It's like a hearing. And then they make a decision. And while you're waiting for that decision, you're here, you're in Canada, and they say yay or nay. But with the proposed changes in Bill C-2, if you're someone who entered Canada over a year ago and are looking to apply for asylum, now what?
Now an officer, probably in their cubicle in a nondescript government office, is going to review that application on paper. They're going to read the affidavit. They're going to look at the documents. They're going to read about their own research about country conditions. If the officer has something that's confusing to them about this case, if they don't understand something that the applicant said, there's no opportunity for the officer to put those questions to the applicant. There's no provision in the legislation right now for the officer to have a hearing to talk about those issues.
So essentially what you're saying is that the decision would be made by one officer based on the paperwork, and that's that.
If that decision is negative, the only recourse that the applicant has is to the federal court. They can make an application for judicial review straight to the federal court. While the federal court is considering that, the person is not protected from deportation. In fact, the Canada Border Services Agency could start removal proceedings the day after the person receives their negative decision.
So they could appeal, but while they wait, they could be deported, which wasn't the case before. I mean, I don't know. This 1-year cutoff feels pretty arbitrary to me. How do you make sense of that choice?
There is a school of thought where people say, if you are really afraid of returning to your home country, you should make your refugee claim at the first possible opportunity. And if it's taken you a full year to make your claim, you probably don't have a legitimate claim. In some cases, that might be right. But in a lot of cases, it isn't. And I can give a few examples of cases where that logic just doesn't hold up. A person comes to Canada for tourism purposes 5 years ago. They have no reason to fear going back to their country. In fact, they do go back to their country and they're okay. But then things change. A war breaks out. There's a change in government. Now the person is in a situation where they need to seek refugee protection. And actually, they have a visa to come to Canada because they got one for their trip to Niagara Falls before. Now they hop on the plane, they use their visa, they travel to Canada. But now, if this bill passes, they're barred from accessing the refugee system because they came to Canada on vacation 5 years ago. There's no connection between that first trip and the risk that the person faces back home because things have changed. I'm thinking I have clients who, they came to Canada as students from Afghanistan, for example, before the Taliban took over. Women, students, educated people from Afghanistan. And when they first came to Canada, they didn't need to make a refugee claim. Things were not great in Afghanistan, but they were a lot better than they are now. August 2021, Taliban takes over Afghanistan. They conquer Kabul. They expel the original government. Allied forces leave. Now it's a very different situation, particularly for women in Afghanistan. And so that person who's been in Canada doing their master's degree, they were okay. Maybe they were going to go back home, to contribute to their country and work in the government. They can't anymore. And it makes sense that they didn't claim initially because they were planning to go back. They weren't afraid, but things changed. And so it doesn't make sense that that person wouldn't be allowed to access the refugee system. This logic of, you should have claimed earlier doesn't really apply. Let's take an example of a gay man from Uganda. He gets a study permit to do a 3-year college program in Canada. He saw promises from previous immigration ministers. Come study in Canada. You'll be able to get a post-graduation work permit. You'll be able to work in Canada, and there'll be a pathway for you to come and apply for permanent residence in Canada. That person looks at that, says, this is great. I'm gay. I'm from Uganda. This is a way for me out of my country. And that person doesn't have to go through the refugee process because he has an alternative stream. He can go through legal alternative immigration processes to get regular status in Canada and stay here permanently. So here's what the person does. He goes through his program. While he's in Canada, he's able to live a much more open out life than he was in Uganda. He attends Pride. He posts, pictures with his partner. But then he sees news that the study program that he was doing in Canada is no longer going to qualify him for a post-graduation work permit. He's not going to be able to work in Canada after, and he's not going to be able to get PR. So now the person is stuck. He didn't have to make a refugee claim when he first came to Canada because he had this alternative path. But now that path is not there for him anymore. The rug has been pulled from underneath him. The promise that the government made to him, they're not upholding. And they're treating people like him who are now going to claim refugee protection, which they need because it's dangerous for him to go back home. He's being treated like a problem, right? Oh, all of these foreign students, they're going to make refugee claims in Canada. Yeah, some of them are. Because some of them are refugees, and they were refugees from the moment they came, but they went through an alternative legal process. They weren't a quote-unquote burden on the system. They went through a regular process. You took it away from them, and now they're going to have to go through the refugee process. But because of this bill, if this person claims as of this past Tuesday, he could be deported without a hearing. Because if he puts forward his PRA application and the board member thinks, you know what, I don't think it's so bad for you. Not the board member, the officer. I actually don't think it's so bad in Uganda. You could go live there. As long as people don't know that you're gay, you'll be fine, right? These are decisions that can't be made in law, but the officer could make them. This person could have a good application for judicial review in the federal court, but CBSA can deport him before the federal court ever gets to his file.
Mm-hmm. And Adam, you're giving me some hypothetical cases here, but these are real people, right?
These cases sound like hypotheticals because I can't give identifying information of people that I know who are in these situations, but these are real situations. These are not hypothetical. And again, remember, this has nothing to do with the border because these are people who are already in Canada.
I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's important to note, as you have, that this change is in fact housed in a broader bill on border security, things like fentanyl and drugs. But there has been a change to asylum seekers who are crossing the U.S. border. Talk to me a little bit about that.
A lot of us have seen the news of how the Trump administration, in a very short time, has radically changed the way that the U.S. treats refugees and migrants.
Dressed for war, clutching onto armoured vehicles through the streets of Los Angeles, where an already zealous immigration department known as ICE has been instructed to ramp up their raids and are doing so with enthusiasm.
There have already been 2 challenges in the Supreme Court of Canada to the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement on grounds that the United States is actually not a safe place for Canada to return refugees to.
For clarity's sake, the way the Canada-US Safe Third Country Agreement works is that you apply for asylum in the first country you arrive in, whether that's Canada or the U.S. So if someone comes from the U.S. into Canada and tries to make a refugee claim, Canada will send them back to go through the U.S. system. This rule only applied at official border crossings, which is why people were trying to enter Canada irregularly, like at Roxham Road, to avoid being sent back. But in 2023, Canada and the U.S. updated the agreement. They made it so that if someone crosses irregularly and is apprehended in 14 days, they'll be returned. But if they haven't, they get to stay and claim asylum.
It was a bit of a fail-safe for people who really need protection. I can give suggestions about better ways to go about doing that than enticing smugglers to bring people across the border and then encouraging people to hide from authorities for 14 days. There are better ways to do this. But this is the system that we have. What the government is doing now with this Bill C-2 is saying that if you did avoid detection for 14 days and you're in Canada and you make your refugee claim, you too are barred from having a hearing. You also have to go through the process and you can be deported without a hearing.
You know, we talked about the 1-year cutoff. We talked about the changes to crossing the U.S.-Canada border. There's another change to the asylum-seeking process under C-2, and we haven't talked about it yet. If the Bill C-2 passes, authorities could suspend, cancel, or change immigration documents. They could immediately pause accepting new applications and pause or cancel processing of applications that are already in the system. Why would they need powers like that?
That's a question for the government. That's not a question that I can answer. The other somewhat concerning aspect of this is that the cabinet could cancel a group of immigration documents. So they could say, this group of people, maybe this group of people from this country, anyone who has a study permit from that country, those study permits are now canceled.
Look, this bill isn't coming out of nowhere, especially the changes to the immigration and refugee front. I've been hearing and reading about the immigration backlog. I am living the immigration backlog, but there's a particularly large backlog when it comes to asylum claims. So as of December of 2024, the backlog for asylum claims was at 267,000 cases. It's nearly a 4-year wait before people hear the decisions made on their cases. But it isn't just the backlog that I've been hearing about. I've also been seeing more accusations that people on student permits or student visas or on temporary permits are somehow gaming the system. And I'm not just talking about the weird, clearly rage bait Twitter accounts. I'm talking about this coming from folks like Mark Miller, the ex-immigration minister, and Pierre Poilievre.
The problem right now is that if someone gets in illegally, and even if they're not a real refugee, they're not fleeing danger, they have 7 or 8 years of appeals.
There's some opportunism that's being used and exploited there. This is a program that was aimed at international excellence and not a backdoor entry into Canada for whatever reason.
Even the newly appointed immigration minister, Lina Diab, herself said asylum can't be used as a shortcut to immigration. Quote, if you want to immigrate to Canada, we have rules, we have processes, please use them. End quote. Is this bill even addressing the backlog or, this so-called gaming of the system?
Well, I want to address two things. First, let's talk about gaming the system. We absolutely do have rules in Canada about who's entitled to certain immigration applications. The same thing goes for our refugee laws. We have refugee laws in Canada for a reason. It's because Canada is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. We have international obligations to protect people from refoulement, which is to send people back to a country where they have a well-founded fear of persecution. Canada cannot get around that. Short of stepping out of the Refugee Convention, that I don't advocate for them to do, and I don't anticipate they're going to do. So a person who faces persecution asking for protection in Canada is not a gaming of the system. It's not a loophole. It's part of our law. Are there people who might make unmeritorious refugee claims? Absolutely. Refugee claims are refused every single day, but they go through a process. Every single person has a right to make their claim for refugee protection. To claim asylum is a fundamental human right. To receive asylum is not. Not every single person in the world is entitled to it. Should that process go faster? Absolutely. And people who make unmeritorious claims, their claims should be refused, but fairly.
So then how would you go about dealing with the backlog then?
Let me talk about two possible ways. There are countries, source countries of refugees where nearly everyone is accepted. I'm thinking countries like Afghanistan, like Eritrea. They should be taken out of the queue at the Immigration and Refugee Board, or at the very least, given a very expedited process, maybe a 30-minute interview with an officer that can then be signed off by a refugee board member. That could reduce the backlog of people who are inevitably going to be accepted by and large by the board. Another option would be to play off of something that the government did more recently, which would be to pull people out of the refugee queue if they're working in certain sectors that have labor shortages. There are plenty of industries in Canada today, including many of which have many refugee claimants working in them already. I'm thinking construction, energy, transportation, manufacturing. These industries that Canada needs workers in, it gets rid of the backlog, and it's a fair system that doesn't set people up for deportation without a hearing.
So why avoid those options? That's what I'm having a hard time understanding. If there are alternatives, why this?
There are two global phenomena that are in conflict and are inevitably connected that feed into all of this. One is an unprecedented movement of people fleeing their home countries, either due to persecution, conflict, or other reasons, many of which are either caused or exacerbated by climate change. And this is not going to stop. On the other side, we have seen a significant change in the global north in public opinion towards welcoming refugees over the past decade. We're 10 years on from Canada's response to the Syrian refugee crisis, where we welcomed 25,000 Syrian refugees in 100 days.
We get to show the world how to open our hearts and welcome in people who are fleeing extraordinarily difficult situations.
And that was a campaign platform that gave the Liberal government their first majority and swept them into power. We're in a very different political context than we were before. We're also 10 years almost to the day from Donald Trump coming down an escalator in Trump Tower in New York, talking about how Mexicans are, whatever he called them.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists.
And bringing with him everything that has happened in terms of rhetoric around immigrants and refugees. 9 years off from Brexit that was fueled by xenophobia.
Police in the UK announced an increase in hate crime reports against immigrants and minorities.
All of this has only continued. It's disappointing, actually, to see a Liberal government in Canada putting forth what I think are really conservative policies and are playing into this global ethos of, we can only do so much to welcome refugees. And for many people, this is what makes us Canadian.
Is this the new normal in Canada, you think?
Well, I sincerely hope not. A bill that is about keeping guns and drugs out of Canada, I think we can all agree to that. But guns, drugs, and people, there's one thing in there that's not like the others. There's a point that I want to make, which is that people are comparing this legislation to the United States. This bill is much worse than what the US has on the books. We in Canada pride our system. We are so much fairer than the United States. We are so much more welcoming than in the United States. If this bill passes, the 1-year asylum ban that is in this bill is worse than the US one, because in the US, you can't make an asylum claim after being in the US for 1 year. But in Canada, it's not whether you've been here for 1 year. It's whether you came here more than 1 year ago, even for a couple of hours. And the US doesn't even have something as draconian as that.
What do you say to people who look at this and say, or hear this conversation and say, you know what, we do need an overhaul?
So first thing that I would say is, yes, our system does need changes. Our system needs reform. There are ways to reform the system in a way that is fair, in a way that is legal, and in a way that is Canadian. In Canada, we do not deport people to places they fear persecution without a hearing. I would hope that as Canadians, we agree that if someone faces torture or death in the place that they're going back to, that we will not send them back to that place, because that's not who we are as Canadians. Unless you're an Indigenous Canadian, every single one of us is either an immigrant ourselves or a child or grandchild or great-grandchild of immigrants. My ancestors fled from Eastern Europe from pogroms against Jewish communities there more than 100 years ago now. But when I hear someone say, you know, this is not our problem, I said, well, what if people said that? What if people said that when my family was trying to come to Canada? Canada has, unfortunately, a dark history in terms of saying the problems of the world are not ours. We have an ocean to protect us. In the 30s, Canada turned back the MS St. Louis, where Jews were sent back to gas chambers in Germany. Canada turned back the Komagata Maru. And Canada has apologized for those things. I don't want it to be that 35 years from now, the Prime Minister stands up and apologizes for the bill that the government hopes to pass today.
Adam, thank you so much for taking the time today. I really appreciate it. That's been This Week in Canadian Politics. If you like this episode, please leave us a like, a comment. You can even subscribe and hit the bell to know when we've uploaded. You can also support this show and the network at Canadaland.com/join. Become a supporter. Help make this show possible. Thank you.